On this episode of China Uncensored, to understand why Falun Gong was persecuted, we're going back to Tiananmen Square. Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Last time I talked to you about what Falun Gong is, but why is it persecuted? A lot of people think it's because the CCP was afraid of Falun Gong, or that the practice had grown too large, but that's actually not true. But to understand what really happened, you need to understand how Jiang Zemin, the former top leader of the Communist Party and the guy who started the whole persecution of Falun Gong, came to power. Now, in case you didn't know, politics in China is a fairly dangerous game. In China, you're either rising in power or getting purged. And when you're at the top, that just means everyone else is gunning for you. Case in point, these two guys, Hu Yaobang and Jiang Zemin. China was just emerging from the decade of horror that was the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping, the guy in charge at the time, began a policy of reform and opening up. In other words, China was allowed to have an economy again. If you ever have trouble remembering his name, just think, with economic reforms, this guy didn't want Chinese people to ever be done shopping. Now, Deng called Hu and Zhao his left and right hands. Together, they implemented Deng's economic reforms. But they had their eye on some political reforms as well. They proposed an increase in government transparency and pushed for greater accountability from officials, who believed in more freedom of speech and the press. They also launched an anti-corruption campaign that even targeted the children of top-ranking party elders. Hu Yaobang apologized for the misrule of Tibet by the party and pushed for greater Tibetan autonomy. What happened? Why can't we have that China? Well, that's where the party hardliners, or conservatives, come in. They weren't too fond of that whole, let's loosen the reins of power and let's investigate our children thing Zhao and Hu were proposing. Ultimately, Hu alienated a lot of people and was forced to resign. Sorry, Tibet. Problem is, even though he made a lot of enemies in the party, he was really popular with the people. And so when he died in April 1989, 50,000 students came to Tiananmen Square to participate in his memorial service. Then they figured, well, while we're here, might as well hold some protests. And the hardliners thought, not so much. The Tiananmen Square massacre marked the end of the hope for political reform. Li Peng, the premier at the time, pushed for getting the students out of the square by force and declared martial law on May 20th. He and other hardliners blamed Jiang Zemin for the protests and got him stripped of all power. Jiang Zemin spent the next 15 years under house arrest until his death in 2005. But now there was a problem. I mean, besides the pile of corpses in the streets of Beijing. Zhao was supposed to be Deng's successor. Who would replace Deng as the paramount leader? They needed to find a compromise, someone conservative enough to please the hardliners, but not so conservative that they would stop Deng's economic reforms. And that man was, in the end, Jiang Zemin, the party chief of Shanghai. Thing is, no one really liked Jiang. Nowadays, the Chinese youth lovingly refer to Jiang as haha. That's because he kind of looks like a toad, which in Chinese is hama. So they just changed a letter and turned him into a living joke. And that's about as much respect people had for him back then, too. Since he was from Shanghai, he had a very small power base in Beijing. The Beijing clique, as it came to be known, was led by Beijing Mayor Chen Shitong, who became Jiang's political rival. It was even believed that a prominent military general and his brother, the President of China, were plotting a coup against him. That was only stopped when Deng Xiaoping, who was still wielding real power behind the scenes, forced the president to retire and gave the position to Jiang, making him both the head of the Communist Party and the quote-unquote President of China, a tradition that carries on to this day. That's not to say Deng liked Jiang either. During his famous southern tour in 1992, he specifically stopped by Shanghai, Jiang's power base, and said the pace of economic reform wasn't fast enough, and that central leadership, in other words Jiang, was to blame. That was also right around the time Deng appointed Jiang's successor, Hu Jintao, who would replace Jiang at the 2002 National People's Congress. Hu Jintao was the man Deng really wanted to carry on his policies. So Jiang had until Hu came to power to create for himself a power base, or else possibly face the kind of political purge that befell so many others. So he started purging all the other jerks that got in his way. First up was Chen Shitong, who was thrown out of office in 1995 after a corruption investigation and then sentenced to 16 years in jail. His son was also sentenced. By the way, you'll want to remember that whole corruption investigation as a ploy to take out your political rivals. It kind of happens a lot. However, because Jiang focused all his energies on internal political struggles, China wasn't in such great shape. Systemic government corruption, a surge in organized crime, unemployment, environmental destruction, and an ever-growing wealth gap threatened the regime's grip on the country. Whoa, I'm getting déjà vu. So, what did Jiang do? He began a massive propaganda campaign to show how great he was. Starting sometime after 1996, he made sure state-run People's Daily and the 7 p.m. CCTV national news always carried stories about him as the top news. That was a policy that would remain in effect until 2006, 4 years after Jiang officially stepped down. At the same time state-run media was praising him, he was also using it to crush his political opponents, like Chen Shitong. That didn't set too well with other party leaders. Using the media to smash political rivals and promote a personality cult was something that fell out of favor after Mao Zedong kind of used it to ignite the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, so it was pretty frowned upon in the Deng Xiaoping era. And when Deng died in '97, Jiang lost the closest thing he had to support. So as the 1990s were coming to a close, Jiang's position looked shakier than ever. Jiang needed something that would cement his power after retirement. And in China, there's one way for that to happen. Control the police, control the army. But how is he going to do that? On April 25th, 1999, Jiang got his answer.